you're likely not going to shoot it at farther than 30 or 40. So a lot of this isn't, may not be necessary, but it is to me because I have to feel 100% confident in my setup before I hunt anything. So when it comes down to shooting an arrow for the buffalo, I'm not that concerned with the weight. And then you take the strongest one and put the mark on the top. But sometimes I'll get arrows that don't feel that way. Maybe there's only one, or maybe you hardly feel any, or some will be very light. And a lot of times I'll just set those aside and I'll say those are practice arrows or those are for my camera guys. But they're still perfectly fine arrows. So much of your success is the confidence in your head. It's no harder to shoot at 100 than it is at 20. That's why I take the time and do all this, because you just never know when that animal of a lifetime might be out there at 80. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on another episode here. Up to this point, we've been doing, mostly food plot stuff and stuff outside, for spraying and planting and all that kind of stuff. But it's time to start thinking about archery, start thinking about our bow stuff again. And normally it wouldn't be such a big deal, but this year I have a buffalo hunt literally on the 28th, so I'm leaving in like 2 weeks. So normally I have everything dialed in. I know what weight arrow I want. I know how much F.O.C I want. I know what speed I want. I know all that kind of stuff. And it basically it's set up here that I hunted with turkeys this year. So my bow setup is basically, right now is a Matthews Phase 4. I use a Carbon Express Photon 350 arrow, Rage Tripans. That one doesn't have one on there. A Rage Tripan broadhead, and it'll just kind of depend from year to year what insert I'll use. This year Carbon Express came with like different weight systems, which is awesome. That right now I don't have all their new stuff, but I have like a 50 grain insert, a 40 grain insert, and a 17 grain insert. So there's a lot more flexibility with arrow spines and weights and things like that. But I use a Spot Hog, Hogfather sight, and I would never, for me personally, I would never use anything but that. That's like such a key piece of equipment for me. And use a Keyway D rest, and of course I always have my Tacticam on there, and the Matthews stabilizers. But that's my setup basically. But just kind of want to go through. And my release is a Carter Target 4. Had this release for probably 20 years. It's performed well for me, so I keep it. But one of the first things that I do, and I think it's the most important thing. Back in the old days, we used to number our arrows, and you always had like your number one arrow that shot the best, and all your other ones, you'd all give them a little bit of a turn. You turn your knock a little bit, until you kind of pulled it into the group. But like now we do that, I spine test them all beforehand, and it basically takes that out of it. So the very first thing I do, and again, now I'm doing this buffalo hunt, and I'm not exactly sure what arrow combinations, because it's going to change a little bit. I was talking to Matt over at Faradyne today, about, if I should use a Tripan. We both kind of agreed, hey, let's go with maybe the Muzzy Trocar fixed blade broadhead for this. So I got to be perfectly tuned and everything. You can make any arrow fly perfectly, but you got to pay a little bit more attention when you have a fixed blade. But I am getting some other options as well, so we'll see when those get here. You'll see as this progresses here, I'll be trying different broadheads and see which combination. And this Trocar would be perfect. I wouldn't even have to look at anything else. The only problem for me, and it's probably not that big of a problem, is that it has a little bit of a right helical on it. Not that they're just offset in the ferrule. If you look down you can see the back end a little bit, and it's a slight right offset helical on it. And of course with the Matthews, or most bows actually, your arrow comes off the string with the left helical. That's why we always fletch all of our stuff with the left helical, so it comes off spinning counterclockwise with the string. And if I use the right helical to match this, what they do is just knuckleballs for a minute and then start spinning. But I really don't want that knuckleball in there because if it's windy or something else, that gives it a chance, or it's not rotating, not keeping it straight to get your arrow off. So I definitely do not want that knuckleball in there. So the next question is, will my vanes, be able to steer, oversteer what this does? And I'm pretty sure. I mean, it's very small offset on there, but I'm going to have to shoot them and try them. That just sticks in my craw a little bit on that, because I normally, even if it made no difference at all, if you did a math equation and figured out that it's basically negligible, it would still bother me. That's the way I am, and so much of your success is the confidence in your head. And that's why I do so many of these things and pay attention to so many little things. When you have confidence, you just know you're going to go out and make a good shot. That's normally what happens. It's anytime I have a little doubt about something, you get some doubt in your head, that just throws me off on everything. So we'll go through about, like I said, if it was just a normal deer or elk season, I know exactly what I'm going to do. So this is a little bit different. So I'll kind of go through my normal routine here. So I don't know if I'm going to shoot a 300 spine or a 350. It'll all kind of depend on what the weight comes out when I decide on which, what insert and broadhead and all that kind of stuff. But the biggest thing is, like, if I look at this right now, in the old days, we always looked for straightness. And so I have this on here, and arrows are so good nowadays, you don't even have to. I mean, I've spun up just a whole bunch of these, because when we just came out with these photons last year, people asked me a lot of times last year, like for my whole hunting season, I just had arrows on here that were just white. And once people started seeing pictures, they're like, what arrow was that? I said, well, it was a prototype last year. And it performed so well, it was so accurate and so awesome for me that, Carbon Express came out with those photons, and this is the finished product right here. But, the first runs that came out, talked with Matt Peters over there and stuff, and we were, talking about, hey, how's the straightness, how's everything look now that it's a final product coming off the, the line and everything. And so I checked about every single one, and they're on a digital scale, 0. Now, not one single arrow even had a bit of fluctuation. And so you don't really even need to anymore. So many of them, they're just so accurate. Now the straightness is so good on all these. The only thing that I will do on most of these arrows, because all these arrows they're built around a rod, and you pull that rod out when it's still warm. And sometimes on the end, I mean, it's perfectly straight, and the OD and ID should be very, very good. But sometimes when that's warm, if they don't pull that out exactly straight, if it gets off a little bit, it can kind of egg shape the ends of them a little bit. And that's the only thing. And so we have these pins that you put in there, and you can spin it and see if that pin is straight. And those are things, I never found any on these either. But if you just cut off the back end, because you're always going to cut off the front, but the back end is what's more important when it's on your string than the front end. So I would just cut off 1 inch of the back end all the time, just in case when that rod was coming out, if it kind of egged out, if it wasn't perfectly straight coming out. And that'll 90% of the time solve that problem if you were to have it. But like I said, I don't hardly use the pins anymore and do it. I might throw them in a couple, the gauge pins, just to see that the ends are straight. But when you cut off the back end, it isn't. That basically takes that away. But the most important thing here is the spine testing for me. And let's see, you put some weights on here, or it puts weight down in the middle, and I'll have to just explain it to you, but like, I can spin this, and you always feel like 2 hard spots in it, and one will be stronger than the other. Like here, this is where the weak spine is at the top. And like, if this had no friction on here, it would automatically pop to the top every time. And like since there's some friction here, I can set it someplace where it won't come to the top. When I go close to it, it'll pop to the top. But at Matthews, they have made one with air pressure that just floats it in the air and pushes down there, and boom, it'll pop to the top every time. So I look at this right now, and it's hard to explain. If you were here, you could spin this. Oh yeah, I feel that. That it's different. That there's the weak spine is at the top right there, and I can tell everyone. I can close my eyes. I can look away. It's where the photon is on the top of the arrow. I can look away. I know exactly where the weak spine is on it. It's right there with this photon on the top. So I take a marker, and I'll mark the back end of it there. So that's where the weak spine is on that arrow for this one. And you said every arrow that you spin, that you feel in here, it normally will have like 2 hard spots where you feel like bump, 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 and one will be stronger than the other. And then you take the strongest one and put the mark on the top. But sometimes I'll get arrows that don't feel that way. Maybe there's only one, or maybe you hardly feel any, or some will be very light. And a lot of times I'll just set those aside and I'll say those are practice arrows, or those are for my camera guys. But they're still perfectly fine arrows. It's just that I can't tell that everyone is exactly the same as the next. And so I can go through a dozen. There might only be 1 or 2 that isn't, that just a bump, 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 bump on the things. So I try to get every one of them that feel exactly the same. And I'll use all those other ones like for my practice arrows and things like that, because there's still the weak spine in there. I can still see where that is. But my hunting arrows, it'll always be the ones that I feel are the 90% of them that feel exactly the same. And to me, this is the most important part of building an arrow, and mostly because, you know, out at Matthews, all those guys have been friends of mine for 20 years, and Tiffany's cousin, John, works there. One of my best friends, Brad True, and Mark Hayes, and all these guys. And just the way that I do seminars on deer, I never have anything, no topic. And I don't have anything, I don't want to regurgitate something. We just go into a seminar and say, what do you guys want to talk about? Because I've never in 20 years ran across a question that I hadn't thought of. I mean, I may not know the answer all the time, but I had thought of it and experimented with it, and I can tell you what my thoughts or what my findings are on it. And when it comes to arrows and bows, I can go to Mark and John or Brad or Matt at Matthews, and there's nothing that they haven't thought about either. So I get a lot of great information on this, and this is really how I can really drive this home is Tiffany's cousin John, when he first started working at Matthews, he was working on the crossbows, the sub 1. And that was basically, if you take that crossbow, you put it in a vise. Now this, it can't move, it's in a vise. You pull it back, and a machine pulls the trigger, shoots the same arrow, the same time, at the same positioning every time. And that's where they got the sub 1. If you shot, it wasn't that you shoot a bunch of arrows, you could shoot one arrow in almost to the same hole, less than 1 inch gap or grouping at 100 yards. And so that's where they got the sub 1. But if you took, I got some little kids running around here. If you took just a random dozen bolts and put them in and shot them, it was like a 16-inch circle. Now, you think about that. You're talking a crossbow. Of course, there's a lot more force and there's a lot more dynamic stuff going on, in a crossbow than there is on a vertical bow. But still, you take, something in a vise shooting the exact same thing, exact same every time, and it's a 16-inch group at 100 yards, and now you're trying to do that, just freehanding it. But then when you would spine test all the bolts and do what we're doing right here, just that part of it, it would bring it down to like a 3 to 6 inch grouping on that. So that's why it's very important, even if you're a crossbow hunter, that those bolts just don't grab a random bunch of bolts. And that's why people think, oh, it's like a gun. I can shoot at 80 yards, I can shoot at 100 yards. No, you're talking in a vise, the same spot every time, 16-inch group at 100 with just random bolts. So you can see how important that is, with something in a vise and everything, you're talking 16 inches. And so many times, like when we sight in bows here for people and stuff, say, okay, let's go shoot it at 100. They're like, oh, I can't shoot it at 100. And it's like, what do you mean you can't shoot it at 100? It's like, we have like the orange dots that come in the package. And it's like a 3-inch dot at 20 yards. But the dot that we make at 100 yards is like 8 or 10 inches. And you look at that ratio, looking through your peep sight and looking at your pin, the ratio at 20 yards, that 3-inch circle, how big it is compared to where your pin sits on, is like exactly, and we make the dot at our 100 yards like exactly that same ratio. So it's not that you can't hold it steady at 100, it's the same ratio for how big it goes through your peep. And on here, at 20 yards is no different than at 100 yards. The difference is if you don't have good form, your bow's not tuned, your arrows aren't tuned, that's why you're 2 feet off. And so many times you shoot at 20 and you're like an inch off, you think, oh, that was a good shot. you shoot that same shot at 100 and it's 3 feet off. You're like, oh, that was terrible. So that's why we hardly never shoot at 20 yards. And it's just always, that's what we used to do. We used to just go to the archery shop and pound 800,000 arrows into the targets at 20 yards. And it was fine for back in those days when we were just bow hunting for whitetails and we were shooting 18 to 25 yard shots is all we ever had. And so it was fine for that. But look, that's what your muscle memory gets. Like I said, if you had poor form, you'd say, okay, I'm shooting good enough at 20 yards, but at 100, it's terrible. But now that's what your muscle memory is in bad form. So that's why we always just shoot like at 100 yards, because you see all those little things. There's no getting away from it. So if you have a little bit of bad form, your bow's not tuned right, your arrows aren't tuned right, you are not going to be able to consistently shoot them in a 10-inch circle like you can at 20 yards in a 3-inch circle. So that's what I'm saying is like it's no harder to shoot at 100 than it is at 20. I mean, for how steady you can hold it and all that kind of stuff, it's all your form, your arrows, and your bow. And so that's why you should just be shooting at 100 yards. That's what we have, the 100-yard target out here. And if I shoot 100 shots in a day, 99 of them will be at 100 yards, because that is where you see when everything is right. And you can get your timing. It's kind of like, okay, I got to make sure. You just do this, punch it a little bit one time, and it's 2 feet off. If you're shooting we have an elk target out there too, you do that and you shoot it right over the top and it's in the field. So that's why it gets you more like you're shooting an animal, that every shot matters. Like when you're just pounding 1,000 at a 20, it doesn't matter. You're not going to miss the target. But when you have that, like a deer target, or we have our antelope 3D target out here at 90 yards, you better be concentrating on that, because you flinch a little bit, you're missing it. And that's the way it is when you're hunting animals too, and that's the way it should be. That's what your muscle memory should be. It should be, okay, I'm taking my time, I'm checking the wind, do I need a little bubble into the wind? What? I need a perfect form. Talk myself through it, okay, this is gonna be perfect, boom, let it go off, and you'll hit it. It's just as easy to shoot them at 100 yards as it is at 20. And the problem is you don't spend enough time doing these things. And like I said, normally I already know what I would be shooting. But on this buffalo hunt, it's going to be a little bit different. You're talking it's a 4,500 pound animal. And so the first thing that will come to mind for people is, oh, what arrow are you going to shoot for that? So, well, probably the same arrow that I shoot for everything else, for deer. And they're like, well, then you can do a lot heavier. It's like, no, not necessarily. And that's the first thing people think. And that's, there's something to it, but to me, it doesn't make that much difference. And so that was one of the things when we were going to talk about this, is I wish I had somebody here to ask questions, because I know there'll be a lot of questions on this, like what about weights? You got to have heavier arrows, all that kind of stuff. So try to answer. This might get a little bit long or winded, but I know the questions that people have asked me about this before, and I'll give you the answers to them, to what I think. And of course, there's no right or wrong. It's whatever works for you. But if you take, I was just talking to Mark Hayes at Matthews the other day, and if you take a 400 grain arrow and a 600 grain arrow and shoot both of them, you'll see that you'll gain in kinetic energy with the heavy arrow 3% more than you will with the lighter arrow. And you got to think about it is, when you pull your bow to full draw, that's your stored energy. That is not going to change. It doesn't matter if you have a 1,000 grain arrow or a 10 grain arrow. You have the same amount of stored energy in there. That is not going to change. The only reason that a heavy arrow even gets that 3% more kinetic energy is because bows are more efficient with a heavier arrow. And basically, I always kind of think of it like as a golf swing or a baseball. You can swing as hard as you want at a baseball. You hit it at the end or hit it at the grip, it's not going that far. And sometimes you can just do a nice easy swing and hit it in the sweet spot, and you hit it out of the park. But Mark had a good point, more like fly fishing, because if you just try to whip a fly out there, that you can only get it so far. But when everything is right, when you're loading the rod at the right spot and your string, everything is going in sync, it doesn't take much effort. You're getting the most efficiency out to throw that thing far. And it's the same thing with a bow. With the heavier the arrow, it loads the limbs right. I mean, the last thing that should come across is your nock on your arrow. So all your limbs load, your cams load, everything, the heavier it is, the bow is a little bit more efficient. So it has nothing to do really with, your bow's not shooting it faster, it's not shooting it any different than the light arrow, it's just that it's a little bit more efficient. So when you looked at kinetic energy with the 600 grain arrow compared to a 400 grain arrow, there was 3% more energy in the 600 grain. But there was almost 27% loss in velocity from the 600 to the 400. Now, you're talking almost 30% drop in velocity, like your speed. And to make up that 3%, you would basically have to add like 1.5 to 2 pounds, depending on the bow. But if you added 2 pounds to your bow, that would give you more than 5% increase in the energy. So really, if I want to shoot a 600 or 500, I can get more energy and over 30% more velocity out of the 400 just putting my bow up 2 pounds. So that's where it kind of gets you. I mean, there is the momentum side of it and all that kind of thing that I think, like for Tiffany, we think more about that, and we'll do a piece on her bow setup because we have to get that set up because we're not exactly sure what bow she's going to be shooting yet this year and all that kind of stuff. So we'll go through all that too for women out there. We'll go through the same thing with them. But that was probably the biggest, I don't necessarily want to say a misconception because you can look at the momentum side of it. But for someone like myself, as like a 30-inch draw, shooting 70 or 75 pounds, whatever I want to, the momentum factor is, it's not going to matter that much. If it's so hard of like a brick that you're shooting into, it's not going to go through whether I'm shooting a 1,000 grain arrow or a 200 grain arrow. But if it's something that you can break, like a bone, it isn't going to matter with the amount of kinetic energy that I store into my bow. It's more depends on like your broadhead. I mean, is your bow flying perfectly straight? Is you have a sharp broadhead, and that for penetration and even for hitting a bone, it's still going to break it. You know, it's something. Momentum is something to talk about, but to me, it's not. It's either, hey, is it possible to break it with a bow or not? And for me, if I'm going to break that bone, and I'm basically just looking at rib bones, you're going to do it with a 600 grain arrow or a 400 grain arrow. But something like for Tiffany, like I said, is different. But I just look at the energy, and you look at velocity. I want to keep my bows like at 285 feet per second on the slow side to like 300 or 305. And to me, that's the sweet spot where it's controllable, it's quiet, everything is tuned perfectly, and everything. If I go too light of an arrow, I can get more speed, but it just doesn't seem to be as consistent. Like it's not in the sweet spot for me, and the bow is a little noisier, and I just don't shoot it as well. So between that 285 to 300 really is my sweet spot. So when it comes down to shooting an arrow for the buffalo, I'm not that concerned with the weight. I'm more concerned with what head, something super strong, it's going to get good penetration. I really want a strong arrow at the end, and I normally shoot an arrow around 430 to 460, and I would even go up to 500 on this, because I want to keep 15 to 17% front of center. So it's all going to depend. If I use a little bit heavier, if I might use a 125 grain head, and I might use a heavier duty insert, something stronger. It might be a little bit on the heavier side, but as long as I can still keep the speed between that 285 and and 300 and the F.O.C. at 15 to 17, that's all I'm really concerned about. So that's what I'll be doing. I'll be trying lots of different combinations for basically see what the F.O.C. I get out of them, weight out of it, and speed out of it. When it comes to fletching, Justin, he was just asking me about why, we always used to just use 3, longer 5 or 6 inch veins. Why does everybody seem to go into the 4s or 5s even? And the reason is, for me, it wouldn't really matter like on whitetails, but a lot of the reason why I use a small vein, and this one is even bigger than I normally use. I normally would use the 2 inch, a real small one with the shield cut is what I'd been using in the past. But I do a lot of western stuff like mule deer and stuff, and it is always windy. I mean, it's always just 30 to 40 mile an hour crosswinds, it seems like every time, and with sheep and things like that. And when you're shooting long distances, I mean, a lot of mule deer been 80, 90 yards, sheep up to 100 yards and things like that. It's a lower profile on here, so it gets less wind drag on the side, but because it's a lower profile, you need 4 vanes instead of 3 to get the same amount of surface area to spin and guide that arrow. Now, another thing is I may go to, we'll just see when if I use a fixed blade for this buffalo hunt, if I think 3 vanes, like a 3 max stealth, compared to 4 of the hybrid 26s. And that's what I've just been using this year, or with the 23s, as the hybrid Plastifletch Max 23 is what these are. And I basically went to that because the other, it's just a little bit longer, so I have a little bit more area, and it's not a shield cut, with just a regular cut on that, it's a little bit quieter. Shield cuts, I really like them, but they're a little bit noisier. And so especially at long shots, I want to keep this as quiet as I possibly can. And that's another thing that I'll come to when I'm looking at broadheads. Is I really like this trocar. It's small and the blades, but sometimes when you get the cut out of the blades here, it'll whistle some, you'll get some more noise out of it. So I'll probably experiment with several different ones to see which ones are the quietest. But I mean, ultimately it'll be which ones fly the best. And like for me, I would really actually feel comfortable shooting a tri-pan with it. But, just something 4,500 pounds is way bigger than the elk and moose and other things that I've shot with a Rage tri-pan, and they've been awesome. I know they have made in the past, I don't even know if they still do, but like 150 grain solid steel Rage tri-pan, and I would feel totally comfortable with that too. And I always usually use the retractable because of accuracy. I mean, I always feel that if your bow is tuned perfectly, accuracy is number one. And for me, with the retractable, I can always shoot it. I feel like it's more accurate than the fixed blades. So that's why I normally always will shoot a Rage tri-pan. And like I said, I know I can make this fly perfect too. And especially since it's only one hunt. And I'll go out there with a bare shaft too, and we'll test that there. But sometimes, like if I was just hunting here or set up camp someplace, I have no problem shooting a fixed blade. The difference is, like, I sit here and I might test this and shoot it in my basement where I got no humidity and consistent temperatures. My bow is going to basically shoot exactly the same, but then all of a sudden you go to 11,000 feet and 90 degrees and high humidity. You just don't know what the string is going to do and what your bow is going to do, how it's going to react. And if it's not shooting exactly straight, exactly the way it was, I just feel with the fixed blade, the big wing out there, it's going to be less accurate than with a retractable. So, something like this, if I do use a fixed blade on this buffalo hunt, I'll make one of my arrows, the arrow that I use here to bear shaft test it. I'll bring that with me and I'll have a target out there. I'll just make sure that my bow's shooting exactly the same with the bear shaft, and I can then make adjustments there if I need to. But so that's kind of in a nutshell my theory on weights. I'm not going to go shoot a 700 grain arrow for buffalo, and I'm not sure what it'll be. It'll probably be someplace between 450 and 500, but those are probably the max and minimum weights that I shoot on it, because that's where I think I'm going to be able to get something that's like 15 to 17 front of center, and still keep my speed between 285 and 300. So that's the most important numbers to me for this. And I'm not exactly sure, like I said, what combinations, but it's nice with Carbon Express, has all the different weight systems that you can use for inserts, so I can see how much front of center weight. I can, if this arrow, if I use a little bit heavier, if I go to a 300 spine, and okay, I need, you put in a lighted knock, that's an extra 20 grains in the back. Now I got to get enough weight in the front to keep that 17% F.O.C. on there. Then I'll see what the total weight is. If it's over 500, I'll go to a 350. Try the same different combination. So over time here, over the next couple days, I'll figure out what that's going to be for this bow, and we'll go from there. But that in a nutshell, how I figure out, what arrow I'm going to shoot. It might be different than most people. Most people are probably thinking weight's most important, but to me it's F.O.C. and speed, because if you look at the difference, like I was talking before, like the 3% loss, but 27%, almost 30% loss in velocity. Even with my setup, like I had a 30-inch draw and close to 300 feet per second, you look at 100 yards where you shoot, you go to 101 yards, it drops 7 inches. So just look at that, think about that. I've never done that. I always range for myself, but if you have a guide, somebody that's standing 4 yards behind you and telling you what yardage, and if they're not compensating for how far they are in front of you, just think that 4 yards off at 100. If you're out shooting a sheep or something, and all of a sudden you're at 7 inches per yard on that, and he's 4 yards off, you can see how easily you can miss. And that's, for me, you think of someone like Tiffany, what that is with somebody with a 24.5-inch draw and shooting like 60 pounds. That is huge. And we'll go into that too. That's why I use a Spot Hog Father. When I can use Archer's Advantage computer program, put all my weights in, it spits out the tape for me every yard. So if I range them at 101 yards, I put this to 101 yards, and I'm going to be right on. I don't have to worry about that 7 inches. I'm not gapping anything. I'm not doing anything like that. And so many people will be like, well, what if it's, if it's at 30 and it runs out to 40, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I let down and I range it again. I just feel like, and I've never once had a problem with that. But I've had problems when I had fixed pins looking through my peep sight trying to judge distances, because that is not the place to judge distance. When you're looking through with one eye, basically you have no peripheral vision, you have no depth perception, and you're trying to guess, okay, that's how far away that thing is. And in the heat of the moment, when your heart's pounding, you got buck fever and everything, okay, now I'm gonna guess accurately through my peep sight at full draw. Most people just want to hammer that trigger and send that arrow down there. So for me, it's always better, even if it's right there, let it down, re-range, okay, it's 44, put it to 44 yards, pull back, and I always feel confident that way, and it's never come up where it screwed me, where one ran out and I didn't have time to re-range it and things. But that's why I think it is so important to use a sight tape, and a sight like this Hogfather, that you can get every individual yard, because when you start looking at it, you pull it up on your Archer's Advantage and put it in your system, it's an awesome program, because it not only makes your sight tapes, it tells you it has like all the animals, like if you're a 3D shooter, like how big the 10 rings are and how much off you can be. If it's actually at 40, will you still be in the 10 at 41 to 38? Tell you what range you could be in, yards, and it's amazing. You see how tight of a little range that is. Even at 50 yards, if you're off 4 yards or something and you're guessing, you're not hitting that 10 ring. So that's why I think it's super important to keep it fast, as fast as I can. Like I said, that's why I picked the 380 or the 280 to 300, and that's where that comes from, is because back in the days, when I was younger and I just deer hunted, you shot them at 18 or 20 yards. It didn't matter that much. But now that you're going out hunting sheep and western hunts and stuff like that, that's where this sight is going to make a huge difference for you. That's why your choice of arrows, spine testing, everything, all those are going to make a huge difference. And unlike this buffalo, you're likely not going to shoot it at farther than 30 or 40. So a lot of this isn't, may not be necessary, but it is to me, because I have to feel 100% confident in my setup before I hunt anything. And so those are just, in a nutshell, my arrows and stuff. And we'll go next, I'll go down and build a few, and we'll show you kind of how we tune it too for the bow. I'll start with, most people just do paper tuning, but that's just a start for you. That's like your big moves. I move my top hats up here, get that through. But you look at like paper tuning, you think you got a perfect bullet hole, you can take 5 steps back, 5 steps forward, and it won't be the same. You're still porpoising it, that close. You've got to get like the 20 and 30 yard, bear shaft testing them to really pull that in, feel 100% confident in your broadheads. And that's where we'll go to all this Trocar, and we'll out at Faradyne. They're going to try some of their other broadheads too, and we'll just see whatever one we decide to use. It's going to fly perfectly. It's going to fly like my field tips before I ever leave this house. So, but that's in a nutshell. If you have any questions, just kind of try to answer them so we got kind of long-winded here, but I just kind of keep thinking of the answers, the questions that people ask about this. And this is just me, of course. You know, you can ask somebody else, maybe totally different. I'm not saying that I'm right or wrong or anything else. This is the way that I do it. And, you know, the spine testing is like the most important, but, you know, everything right down the line is very important for accuracy. And it really kind of hits home to me when you think about, when I was talking about the sub 1, you know, for an arrow that's, you just grab a random dozen in a vise, a 16-inch circle. What is that going to be with you just, you know, just freehanding it? And that's why a lot of times people think they can't be accurate at 100, but you can. You can be just as accurate as you are at 20. It's just everything has to be perfect. And that's why I take the time and do all this, because you just never know when that animal of a lifetime might be out there at 80, 70, 60 yards, you know, things that you never even thought of before. And you can send an arrow down with 100% confidence that you're going to 10 ring that thing. So if there's questions on this, you know, we'll try to answer them as, you know, when the episode airs. But we're just at the beginning of it now. I'll get stuff set up, and then the next section here we'll go into tuning when I figure out the arrow with the right weights and everything. But I think, you know, I have a lot of work to do. I'm going on this buffalo hunt, and since we've been doing these, you know, the YouTube thing, that buffalo hunt, really I'm doing it on June 28th, so it's coming up in 2 weeks, and that will, once we go do that hunt, that'll be on YouTube the week after. And you'll see how these arrows performed and how they did, if I choose to correctly or not. But I think this is enough. I think it's long enough here just about on arrows and weights and bows and sights and a few things that I touched on. And I know that'll probably generate some questions to try to answer all those questions, but so we're gonna cut it here. And so any questions that you may have, or something maybe if I didn't explain, or something you don't agree with or do agree with, like I said, I'm not the all-out authority on this. This is just what I do and what works for me. And maybe you have some tips, something that I don't know, you know, something that I should be doing differently. But this is what I've been doing for years, and it's worked great for me. So once again, thanks for tuning in. Appreciate it so much. And thanks for watching, and hit subscribe.